This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Polls suggest that Latino voters will be critical in deciding this November's election in the United States. In today's episode, we'll explore the complexities of this group of voters and why economic and social issues seem to have been pushing them toward the Republican Party in recent elections.
And not so much a change, it's always been at the heart of the way that Latinos will vote. Basically, Latinos in this country have come to work and they want to work. They will take more than one job. They will do anything to advance the next generation to a more equitable and a more prosperous future. So the economy has always been. You ask a Latino, do you care about being represented more in Hollywood or in the media or, on broadcast TV? They will say, no, just give me a job. Just give me a job and make me able to advance in this American dream that I'm after.
Several years ago, an idea took hold in U.S. politics, especially inside the Democratic Party. The idea that demographics is destiny. This was a theory that as the United States became less white over time, and as the Latino population especially grew, that this would be a huge advantage to the Democratic Party, which was performing very well among people of color. Well, here we are in the year 2024, and it hasn't turned out that way. Republicans have grown their share of the Latino vote in each of the last two presidential elections. Donald Trump took about 30% in 2020, and polls suggest he may now be drawing an even bigger share of the Latino vote in 2024, which many find surprising when you consider what he has said about Mexicans and immigrants more generally. On today's episode, we're going to try to explore the fascinating complexities of the Latino community in the United States, their history, why they should not be treated as a monolith, and why they do indeed seem to be undergoing a rightward shift in recent years. Our guest is Marie Arana. Originally from Peru, she is the author of an exceptional book about the history of Latinos in this country, much of which, I have to confess, I did not know. The book is called LatinoLand, a portrait of America's largest and least understood minority. Marie is a journalist, a writer of a number of books about Latin America, a former Washington Post editor, and she was the inaugural literary director of the Library of Congress. We're going to talk a lot about history and about the present as well. Marie, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you so much, Brian. Such a pleasure to be here with you.
Marie, you say in the subtitle of your book, you call it Latinos, America's largest and least understood minority. What did you mean by least understood?
Well, there are so many ways that we are least understood. In the first place, we are invisible in the sense that we are always being asked, who are you? And are you really one? And where did you come from? And what do you mean? And how are you an American? And we're always being asked that question. So there is that sort of neglect and invisibility aspect. But there's also, we're thought of as being recently arrived. And we have been here since before the Pilgrims actually came to Plymouth Rock. I mean, there are many of us who are part Spanish, part indigenous, Mexicans especially, who count 46 million in this country, whose roots have been on this territory, on this continent in North America. And so when people think of us as recently arrived, they don't understand the history. So there is a misunderstanding there. The fact that we have fought in every war that America has ever prosecuted, including the Revolutionary War. These things, add up to a kind of longstanding ignorance about the Latino population and our contributions to this country.
So as you point out, this is a story that goes back hundreds of years. At the same time, you also write in your book, you talk about how the story of Latinos in the United States has really changed a lot in the last 70 or 80 years. your family arrived in the United States from Peru in the 1950s, when Latinos were only about 2% of the population here. Today, that number is closer to 20%.
Right, right.
How have you seen things change for Latinos in the US as a result of that growth?
Okay, this is another aspect of how we are misunderstood because we have historically been miscounted and in many ways uncounted. Because if you go back to through history, you see that when the United States took over the Spanish colonial lands, which were basically all the way from California to Kansas and all the way from the border, what is now the border, all the way up to Colorado, that huge chunk of land, which was previously Mexican. Um, when that happened, when the Mexican War, Mexican US War happened, Mexico insisted that Latinos, Mexicans be counted as white because only white people could vote in the country at that time. This was in the 1840s, 1848 to be exact. There's also the point of self-discovery, right? Where people haven't realized that they were Latinos, and then they do because they've done their DNA or they've done their ancestry.com or whatever, and so they realize that they are. And there are also the Afro-Latinos who, people forget that when 12 million Africans were shackled and brought over to the Western Hemisphere, 12 million of them, of the 12 million of them, 350,000 came to the United States, and all the rest, 11 million, there, of course, a million died, but more than 10 million went to Latin America and the Caribbean. So there are those who've come to this country long ago, perhaps, who were Afro-Latinos who didn't register themselves as Latinos. They were called Black because of how they looked. And so they weren't counted. And now I think there's a much more of a understanding of who they are. But there's also this great wave, Brian, of people, of course, who came in the last 40 years. When the border was essentially opened to people in 1964, 65, and it wasn't just to white people coming from Europe, but it was opened up to everybody. And then there was a great wave of people who came from Latin America, also inspired, there's no doubt about it, by the conflagrations and the chaos that was going on in Latin America at the time. A lot of it actually provoked and supported by the United States and its policies.
So, Marie, you have described an incredible tapestry of people from different backgrounds. Given that diversity, and as we look at this upcoming election, does it even make sense to talk about a Latino vote?
In many ways, no. It doesn't make sense. We are such a diverse population. I think we have voted similarly in the past. There was a largely, basically, Democratic vote for many, many years. And that happened at the time of FDR. There was that whole policy switch that happened, and Blacks came over to the Democratic Party from the Republican Party, and so did many Latinos. And so there was that consistent vote for a while. Latinos were basically taken for granted. Many of them were not registered. In fact, many of them still are not registered, which is what makes them such an attractive population to court, because they are largely uncounted by the ballot box. And so that's a great opportunity to go in. But there have been so many changes in the past years that have political changes, social changes, even changes in terms of faith that have caused Latinos to drift towards the Republican Party. And frankly, the Democrats have not really perceived that until this election season. The fact that the Democratic Party has always considered this population to be poor, to need welfare, and to care about DEI policy, about affirmative action. These are things that count less and less to Latinos. Latinos are much more interested in the economy and much more interested in work. So they've been misjudged and somewhat neglected by the Democratic Party. So there has been a very distinct drift to the Republican thinking.
Have you seen any change or improvement in the Democratic Party approach toward Latino voters since the candidate at the top of the ticket changed, since Kamala Harris became the party nominee?
Oh, absolutely. I have seen a tremendous change. And the change is basically because the Latinos were as worried as anybody else about Biden's age. And I think that the whole prospect of having a female president, and we have had female presidents in Latin America for a long time now, many of them, and many of them now are women. So this is actually, I think, as fresh a breeze into Latino thinking about politics and the way that they might vote as it was for anybody else. What Kamala Harris has been promising, in at least, if we can even say, within the last few weeks, which is a much more focused concentration on jobs, on the economy, on the ways that Latinos might actually profit from her policies, and the fact that she has been has had such a strong voice about immigration policy, which is very important to Latinos. The immigration policy that has been basically absent for the past 40 years has been a grave problem for Latinos in general.
Some of this is, assumptions sometimes take a little while to catch up with reality. And I remember hearing during the election 8 years ago, mainly this idea that demographics is destiny. And there was this idea that you heard a lot in progressive circles in the Democratic Party, that the country was becoming more diverse, that it was becoming more brown and black, and that as that happened, the Republicans were doomed because of this idea that the Latinos and the African American population, for that matter, were so firmly in lockstep in line with the Democratic Party. That has obviously not proven to be the case. We have seen in successive elections, as you point out, we've seen it in the numbers, increasing identification amongst the quote unquote Latino vote with the Republican Party. You mentioned several reasons for that, but I want to kind of look at these one at a time. How much of this has to do with religion, Marie?
It has a great deal to do with religion. The evangelicals have made a huge um, inroad into the Latino population. This wonderful pastor I spoke to in for LatinoLand, it was Samuel Rodriguez, who runs 64,000 churches, evangelical churches, and they all represent the great growth of the evangelical movement in among Latinos. So this is a huge change, Brian. This is a tremendous change. Faith has a great deal to do with the political switch that Latinos have experienced.
You also talk a lot in the book, really a rise in economic prosperity. There are some astounding statistics around this. You pointed it out in a recent op ed for the New York Times, that Hispanics were responsible for 73% of the growth in the US labor force between 2010 and 2020. They are founding small businesses at a higher rate than the rest of the population by a considerable margin. It's also true that if Latinos in the United States were their own separate nation, they would represent the fifth largest GDP in the world. How has that changed the way that Latinos vote?
And not so much a change, it's always been at the heart of the way that Latinos will vote. Basically, Latinos in this country have come to work and they want to work. They will take more than one job. They will do anything to advance the next generation to a more equitable and a more prosperous future. So the economy has always been. You ask a Latino, do you care about being represented more in Hollywood or in the media or on broadcast TV? They will say, no, just give me a job. Just give me a job and make me able to advance in this American dream that I'm after. So the economy has always been a part of it. So I don't think it's any surprise to the Latino population that they are as productive as they have been. I think that the opportunities offered in this country have been enormous for Latinos. The fact that what you say, Brian, is that Latinos are the fastest growing small business population in the country is by virtue of the fact that America does offer those opportunities and the Latinos are taking them as much as they can. The purchasing power, 3.5, close to $4 trillion a year, is substantial. And I think that the American business community is just opening its eyes to the opportunities that suggests.
You also talk a little bit about the outreach that the Republican Party has done in recent years, especially. What, in your mind, has been effective from a messaging point of view from the Republicans?
Well, the Koch brothers, particularly, have been enormously successful. They have instituted a national organization called Libre, which means freedom, free. And this organization is very, very successful in going out and canvassing neighborhoods and one on one in a personal way, knocking on doors, registering people, telling people that they can help them in any way possible. They, like the evangelical churches, Libre helps them with, applying for a driver's license or getting their taxes sorted out or, finding childcare. So the Republicans have been really enormously successful in this because they are doing it on a one-to-one basis in an atmosphere in which the Democratic Party has really sat on its haunches and figured that it had the Latinos lock, stock, and barrel when it does not.
So this leads to my next question, which is what do the Democrats need to do differently? I mean, is this essentially, in your mind, partly a failure of, I guess, the identity politics mindset, where perhaps they assumed that they could count on a certain vote because of their ethnic background, but what they really need to be doing is focusing more on a range of issues, and including these kitchen table issues, pocketbook issues that you say the Republicans have been pretty effective at.
Yeah, I think so. I think they have counted on the fact that have assumed that Latinos want more government and that they want, more welfare. And the truth of it is that in all of my research and talking to all the 250 informants, all the way up and down the economic scale, that is not what Latinos want. Latinos basically want the economy to be roaring so that they can take part in it. And the Democratic Party doesn't talk about that as much as it could, and doesn't talk about the policies that it could engage to make that future possible for Latinos.
Maria, I suspect that much of our audience is listening and thinking, okay, so the Latino community in the United States thinks that the Republicans are better on these pocketbook issues. But what about all of the invective, all of the rhetoric that Donald Trump has directed toward immigrants and toward Mexico in particular over the last 8 years? Why is that not more of a turnoff? Why do you still have, I think it's 30 or 40% of Latinos in polls who are willing to support him? What's your answer to that question?
Oh, isn't that interesting? It is. It's so. It makes no sense, right? That people would be willing to ignore that kind of invective. When you think about the experience of Latinos, so many of them who have lived in racist societies in their own countries, who have lived in what we call in Spanish pigmentocracies, where people are judged by the color of their skin. They've got, they've developed hard shells in those terms. They've been called, when I arrived from Peru at the age of 10, I mean, I remember being told by kids in the neighborhood, you stink, go away, go back to where you came from, you stink. So used to that sort of thing. And you learn to keep your head down, work, and keep moving. And I think that the whole population is that way. We don't get riled up by insults. I mean, there are. I'm reminded right here, Brian, of a fantastic poem that was written by Pedro Pietri. He says, they insult us, we work. They throw stones at us, we work. And it goes on like this because it's sort of I know that it's hard to understand why you're so insulted. Why don't you turn away from Trump? It's the thing that counts. The reason why Latinos are attracted to Trump, it has nothing to do with Trump. It has to do with the economy and what the Republican Party promises.
It's fair to note that some people in the community have, of course, been quite upset by what he
Yeah,
said.
yeah. Well, there are those. There are those. Yeah, yeah. There are those, and there should be. There should be. There should be more of those.
Yeah, but your point is that for a variety of reasons, some of them perhaps rooted in history also, you have a large amount of voters who are willing to kind of put that aside and say, I think that my family will be better off if I vote for this man who, literally launched his presidential bid by saying that there were rapists and murderers coming from Mexico.
Yes, but you also have to understand here, Brian, very important point, which is that the Latinos are as upset about the massive crowds coming across the border as anybody else. I mean, that is upsetting. I mean, so many of them who have come over legally and registered legally and been here for generations and contributed so much are worried about the tremendous influx at the border, and just as worried as anybody else, because first of all, you're overrunning the country. You're putting great pressure on the economy as it is, so that the job market is not what it should be, and also because they're being blamed for it, and they're being seen as the people who are producing this, invasion, is what Trump calls it. So it's sensitivity on all sides. When you have an open border like that is not working, it's worrisome to anybody.
We'll be back after a short break. It is the event of the year in Miami for investors and business leaders who are interested in Latin America. The Council of the Americas Symposium and Bravo Business Awards will be held this year on October 30th. This year's honorees include Paula Santilli, the CEO of PepsiCo Latin America, Martin Migoya, the co-founder and CEO of Globant, who will receive an award on behalf of his company, and many more. For more information, have a look at the Council of the Americas website. That's as-coa.org. I was struck by so much of the history that you write about in this book, the way that it does contribute to this idea of a Latino identity such as it exists. And I was hoping that perhaps for some of our listeners who've not read the book, we could talk about just maybe two or three of these key moments. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Pedro Pan initiative of the 1960s and how that was instrumental in so many ways, especially to forming the identity of that Cuban American community, which is all over the United States, but especially in South Florida and New Jersey?
Yeah, the Cuban influx into the United States, which changed the dynamic, I think, radically, and was part of the complication of the Latino identity because it had been so Mexican for so long and so somewhat describable. At the point when we started getting the Cuban influx, the Dominican influx, the Puerto Rican influx that came in the 50s, at that point of the 50s and forward, the whole dynamic began to change because there was a very East Coast perspective now to the Latino population. It wasn't all the Southwest. It wasn't all Mexican Americans. We had very conservative Cubans who were dead set against any sort of socialist or communist movement because of the history that they had lived through during the Castro Revolution. And then you had the Puerto Ricans and the Dominicans who were largely Afro-Latinos, and they had a different perspective. So suddenly the prism began to be wider and more colorful and more distinct. But there's so much history, Brian, that my mission is to sort of get an understanding of Latino history in this country to be broader and to be taught in the schools. So what I mentioned before, that we have Latinos have fought in every war that's ever been prosecuted by this country, back to the revolution. I mean, what school book tells you that George Washington thanked the Hispanics for coming up the Mississippi River when the East Coast was blocked by the British and giving them supplies and giving them ammunition, that George Washington said, I could never have done this if I hadn't had the Hispanics coming up Mississippi in their boats, putting up their flags and giving us arms and giving us food and just fighting with our troops. So, the textbooks don't tell you that. The textbooks don't tell you that David Farragut, who was the first admiral ever in the United States of America was a Hispanic. His name was David Ferragut. His father had fought in the American Revolution. They were from the Balearic Islands. And he was the guy who said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. But nobody says, hey, and that was a Hispanic. That was a Latino. And there's so many examples like this that I try to deliver in the book. Mario Molina, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the ozone layer. And it goes on, and these things are not taught in the schools. The history is not taught in the schools. So that sense of our belonging, of our being very much a part of American history is lost. And that's very much something that I hope this book fights.
So many of these stories were new to me as somebody who, follows Latin America and Latin American politics for a living, and grew up in Texas. I felt like I should know more of this. To bring it back to the present day, I wonder, Marie, if you've thought at all about, kind of the great contemporary comparison to this wave of Cubans who we saw come in the 1960s and 70s. Today, we're seeing, another wave of people from Cuba, as much as 10% of the population has left the island just in the last 4 years. But also, a huge influx of people from Venezuela because of the economic collapse and repression there. Have you thought at all about how that might be kind of the next wave of change that we see in a Latino identity in the United States?
Yeah, well, it depends, doesn't it, on the political temperature in the hemisphere. I mean, when the Salvadorans started to come in from the Northern Triangle, and because of the disruptions there politically and the tremendous violence, I mean, the Honduras and Salvador, just huge violence that was so massive and so destructive and so horrific that it drove whole populations up here. That Salvadoreños suddenly were jumped from being 10th on the ladder of immigrants are suddenly, fourth. And the Salvadoran population of Washington, D.C., which is where I'm sitting right now, has grown leaps and bounds. And it's all because of these moments of disruption. When the Venezuelans started to leave Venezuela some years ago, with Maduro hanging on as much as he had, 5 million left, and they dispersed in all of South America. You find Venezuelans going down to Argentina, working in Buenos Aires, teachers going to Peru and working as waiters, and then you have this tremendous influx here in this country of Venezuelans, and it depends on these waves of sort of political disruption in the hemisphere itself.
Marie, almost half of our audience for this podcast is in Latin America itself. Here's a question. How do all these issues that we've been talking about here around U.S. politics, around the diversity within the Latino community here in the United States, these issues, how do they translate to people in Latin America itself?
I think that Latin America is coming to realize, in the way that the United States may come to realize, that this is the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. The United States has a nation within it that is second only to Mexico in terms of a Spanish-speaking population. It is a nation unto itself. It is a tremendous recourse for Latin America, because just in terms of the money that got set back by immigrants to this country, to their countries. I mean, Nicaragua couldn't exist. Honduras couldn't exist without the money that is sent back. And that is, that's astonishingly important, more and more important, I think, to Latin American countries. And so that awareness is there, and it's very, very strong. And it's the reason why organizations like the OAS, or like the Interdevelopment Bank, or like the World Bank have become so important. And really operations that move business and move cooperation between Latin America and the United States is really this tremendous population of Latinos that we have here, that is as strong a nation as any other, larger than Venezuela, larger than Colombia, larger than Argentina. It's a big deal.
It's such a rich history, Marie. We appreciate you for walking us through a lot of it. I'm sure much of it was new to our audience. Thanks so much for being with us on the podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Brian.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.